The apartment was unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the low, persistent hum of the refrigerator, a mechanical heartbeat in a room that felt dead. I sat on the cold, hard floor, not by choice, but because a chair was a luxury I did not possess. The space was empty, stark, and echoing, a mirror of my own internal state. Around me, my life was reduced to a thin mattress, a phone, a half-empty pack of cigarettes, and a suitcase that had remained by the door for 4 days. I reached out and unzipped the lid. Inside lay designer dresses, each one worth thousands of dollars, fabric that felt like a mockery against my fingertips. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill. $11. Those two numbers, the thousands on the floor and the 11 in my pocket, encapsulated my entire existence. I had traveled halfway across the world to reach this point, to end up back on the floor of a room that held nothing. The air in here tasted like stale dust. I was 20 years old, and for the first time, I realized that the silence was not just in the room, it was in me. I was simply waiting for the floor to stop feeling like the only place I belonged. The silence of the room faded, replaced by the biting wind of an East Side Cleveland winter. I remember the gray apartment blocks, the broken playgrounds, and the cheap grocery store that anchored our corner. Daylight there surrendered to darkness by mid-afternoon, leaving the city in a perpetual, freezing gloom. My mother was a woman of striking beauty, who moved through those cramped rooms like a ghost of a life she never lived. She had once harbored dreams of making it big in Chicago, modeling, casting calls, television, anything to escape the gray. Success eluded her, and she carried that failure like a physical weight. She looked at me not as a child, but as a second chance. She did not teach me to study or to build, but to be seen. She would sit me down, trace the lines of my face, and whisper that beauty was the only currency. By the time I was 10, I knew that being beautiful was the only way to survive the cold. My father's departure was devoid of drama. He simply packed a bag, tied his shoes in the hallway, and walked out. I remember standing there in my socks, a silent witness to his exit, his gaze never once meeting mine. The door clicked shut, and the apartment felt smaller. After he left, my mother became a nail technician, earning just enough to survive. But survival was not her ambition. She craved the opulent life she observed her wealthier clients living. With every glance, she would tell me, "You are beautiful. You will get what I never got." At 13, she enrolled me in a modeling class at the mall. I did not particularly enjoy it, but the pride in her eyes as I walked the runway was enough to keep me moving. She would sit in the front row, filming me, posting pictures online, as if I were already fulfilling the dream she had lost. By the time I graduated high school, my grades were mediocre. I was not unintelligent, but I never believed school mattered. Why would I? At 18, I was working the register at a grocery store. The days blurred into long shifts, aching feet, and meager pay. After covering rent, food, and bus fare, there was almost nothing left. Around that time, my mother moved in with Gary, a used car salesman with a gold watch and a perpetual empty smile. She did not explicitly kick me out, but her words, "You are an adult now," made it clear I was on my own. I moved into a small, cramped room with peeling wallpaper and a radiator that rattled through the night. My adulthood began in that quiet, decaying space. I spent my evenings staring at the cracks in the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the city outside. There was no plan, no savings, and no direction. The glamour my mother promised was nowhere to be found in the fluorescent glare of the store or the damp corners of my room. I was alone, exhausted, and trapped in a cycle that offered no exit. Every morning, I woke up to the same gray light, the same hunger. Then, my phone buzzed in the dark. It was Brianna, sending photos from Miami. One image showed a rooftop party, another a glittering pool, then private dinners and city lights. I sat on my floor, staring at the screen until my eyes burned. She was waitressing, then hostessing, and suddenly her life had transformed into something surreal. I looked at the peeling paint around me and felt a bitter, sharp thought take root. She made it. I did not. Then, a new text arrived. There is an opportunity. Don't judge. It was a simple proposition. Fly overseas, everything paid for, a nice apartment, and fast money. Attend dinners with wealthy men, smile, and look good. When I pressed for details, she replied, "Mostly just look amazing and don't be difficult." I should have understood the warning signs, but desperation is a loud, hungry thing. It silenced my doubt and made me hear only the promise of an exit. A month later, I said yes. A man with no last name and no profile picture requested my passport and photos. 3 days later, he asked if I could fly. I quit my job, told my mother I was going to New York for work, and packed a bag. At the airport, my hands trembled. I believed my life was finally beginning. The first 24 hours felt like a fever dream. A driver in a black SUV met me at the terminal, whisking me through streets that glowed with neon light and past skyscrapers that pierced the night sky. I stared out the window, watching the city blur into a streak of gold and glass. We stopped at a high-rise, and I was taken to the 42nd floor. The apartment was a shock of white walls and cool marble floors. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the ocean, a vast, dark expanse that seemed to stretch forever. A new phone sat on the glass table, and expensive items were laid out on the bed, perfectly sized for me. I stood in the center of the room, the silence of the high-rise pressing against my ears. A profound sense of relief washed over me. A single message pinged on the new phone. Car arrives tomorrow at 8 p.m. Wear the black dress. Be ready. The next evening, the car arrived. I was driven to a rooftop restaurant where the air felt heavy with the scent of expensive cologne. I sat with 2 other girls, surrounded by older men in tailored suits who spoke in low, measured tones. A translator leaned over, whispering that one of the men had remarked that I looked like snow. I offered a practiced smile, keeping my eyes fixed on the horizon. The dinner lasted 3 hours, a blur of clinking glass and polite, hollow conversation. When I returned to my apartment, I found a thick envelope waiting on the table. I tore it open. Inside were $2,000. For one dinner, I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the stack of bills, and I laughed. My mother made less than this in an entire month of long, aching shifts. I had earned it in a single night. That was the moment everything changed. It was not an external shift, but a quiet, internal erosion. I realized then that money could buy more than just comfort. It could buy silence. It could buy denial. It could buy a version of myself that stopped asking questions. The days settled into a rhythm that felt disturbingly easy. Afternoon by the pool, the car at night, the dinner, the yacht, the private club, and always the envelope waiting at the end. I was becoming a ghost in my own life, drifting through rooms filled with people who did not know my name. Then I met Alyssa. She was from Phoenix and had been in the city longer than any of the others. We were sitting in the shade of a terrace when she leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, sharp edge. She gave me the rules. Do not fall for the men. Do not trust the managers. Save every cent. And then she looked at me, her eyes heavy with the darkness. She told me to never, under any circumstances, agree to go to the private villas. I asked her why. She simply said that girls who went there always came back different. I watched her face, searching for a sign of hesitation, but found only a cold, hard certainty. That should have been the moment I walked away. By the end of the first month, I had accumulated more money than I had ever seen in my life. I sent a portion of it home to my mother. She called me the moment the transfer cleared, her voice vibrating with a sudden, sharp surprise. She asked where the money came from, and I told her it was event work. She paused, the silence stretching across the thousands of miles between us. And then she laughed. She told me she knew I would make it. She told me I was beautiful. She asked no further questions. When the person who should be guarding you chooses to look away, it becomes terrifyingly easy to lie to yourself. I hung up the phone, and stared at the walls of my apartment. The guilt that had been gnawing at me since my arrival began to fade, replaced by a hollow, cold satisfaction. If she was satisfied with the result, why should I worry about the process? I started to view my life as a series of transactions rather than choices. Every time I looked in the mirror, I stopped seeing a person and started seeing an asset. I was no longer the girl from the cold streets of Cleveland. I was a product, and for the first time, I felt like I was finally succeeding at the only thing that mattered. Month 2 arrived, and with it, a terrifying sense of normalcy. The initial panic over rent and food disappeared, replaced by a dull, rhythmic comfort. I stopped checking the price of anything. I stopped looking at the news. I stopped wondering about the faces of the men I sat with, treating them instead as obstacles to be navigated or sources to be tapped. I was living in a world of marble and glass, yet my mind was constantly calculating. I kept a ledger in my head. Every dinner was a step closer to a specific number. I did the math every night before I slept. If I kept this up for 3 more months, I could buy a condo back in Cleveland. Not a rental, not a temporary fix. My own keys, my own door, my own life. That was the dream that kept me moving. It was not about the luxury anymore, or the status, or the validation. It was about the exit. I was building a cage of gold, brick by brick, convinced that if I just worked hard enough, I could eventually buy my way out of the very life I was creating. I was deep in my routine, counting the nights until I could finally leave this place for good. My mind was a constant loop of numbers, subtracting expenses and adding up the cost of my freedom. Then, the phone on the table buzzed. A message from the manager. It was short, direct, and impossible to ignore. A private event, held far outside the city limits. The pay was 5 times the usual rate. My pulse quickened. I remembered the words Alyssa had spoken to me weeks ago, her voice low and serious as she warned me never to go to the private villas. She had looked at me with genuine concern, telling me that girls who went there always came back different. I knew she was right, but then I looked at the total in my bank account. I was so close to the number I needed. If I took this one job, I could cut months off my timeline. I typed a single word back. Yes. I told myself it was the final step, the last sacrifice before I could finally walk away. The villa sat isolated, miles beyond the city lights, surrounded by high walls and armed security. As we passed through the gates, the silence felt heavy, pressing against my chest. Inside, a man in a dark suit waited in the foyer. He held out a small tray. Without a word, he signaled for us to surrender our phones. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the device. I placed it on the tray. One by one, the others followed. We were led into a large white room, illuminated by harsh overhead lights. The air was cold, smelling of bleach and something metallic. I looked for a familiar face and found Brianna standing near the far wall. She was usually the one who kept her composure, but as she looked at me, her face went pale. Her eyes were wide, darting toward the door. She leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "Just do what they say," she breathed. "Do not argue." In that moment, the lie of the easy life dissolved. The night ended in a blur of white light and sharp, echoing sounds. I do not remember the drive back. I only remember the bathroom floor. I sat there for hours, staring at the grout between the marble tiles until the sun began to bleed through the window. My body felt like it belonged to someone else, a hollow shell that had been pushed past its limit. I was shaking, unable to stop the rhythmic tremor in my hands. On the counter sat a thick envelope, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. I looked at it, then at my own reflection in the mirror, searching for the girl who had left Cleveland with dreams of a better life. She was gone. In her place was someone who had learned how to endure the unthinkable. I reached out and touched the paper, the texture rough against my skin. I told myself I would never do it again. I promised it was over, but then I opened the flap and counted the cash. The numbers were staggering. I looked at the money, then back at the floor, and a thought crawled into my mind, cold and precise. Just a few more times. That was the moment the real damage took hold. It was not just what they had done to me, but the way I started to trade my own suffering for a future that felt increasingly like a lie. The months bled into one another, a cycle of exhaustion that stripped away everything but the need to survive. I stopped looking at the calendar. I stopped counting the days. I only counted the envelopes. My life became a series of rooms, each one colder than the last, each one demanding more of me. Then, I found Brianna. She was in the bathroom of our shared suite, curled into a ball on the cold tile floor. She was rocking back and forth, a slow, rhythmic motion that made the air in the room feel heavy. I knelt beside her, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but she did not flinch. She did not even look at me for a long time. When she finally turned her head, her eyes were completely vacant, like windows looking into a house that had been gutted by fire. A smile touched her lips, but it was a dead, hollow thing that never reached her eyes. She stared right through me and whispered, "I am just tired." The word hung in the air, a pathetic, fragile code for everything we were losing. We were just ghosts waiting for the next room to open. The final booking was not in a villa, but in a high-rise downtown. No guards at the gate, no other girls. Just one man, a table set for two, and the hum of the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling glass. He poured wine. He gestured to the chair. It felt like a performance I had mastered, a script I could recite in my sleep. But as I took the first sip, a sharp, cold instinct flared in my chest. It was not fear. It was a warning. I stood up, muttered an excuse about the bathroom, and walked toward the hallway. My hand found the door handle. It did not turn. I pulled harder, my knuckles white against the metal. The door was dead, held fast by an electronic lock I could not override. I turned back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The man was still sitting there, watching me with a calm, detached curiosity. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was not a guest. I was not event staff. I was a product, bought and paid for. The room became a blur of motion and sound. I remember a wall, a sharp impact, and then the heavy, suffocating silence of the hallway. He had fallen asleep, his breathing deep and rhythmic, leaving the door card exposed on the table. I grabbed it. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped it twice. I swiped the card, the lock clicked, and I stepped out into the corridor. I was barefoot. The carpet felt damp under my feet. I did not look back. I did not run, because running would draw attention. I walked, my breath hitching in my throat, until I reached the lobby. The security guard looked at me, his eyes sliding away the moment they met mine. He saw nothing. He chose to see nothing. I stepped out into the night. The air was thick, humid, and smelled of salt. I had nothing, no phone, no purse, no identity. I wandered until a guard from a neighboring building handed me water, his face a mask of indifference. I remembered the number. Alyssa answered on the second ring. "I need help," I whispered. She didn't ask. She didn't hesitate. 20 minutes later, her car pulled up. The air in Cleveland hit me like a physical weight. It was biting, gray, and smelled of exhaust and frozen slush. I walked past the same cracked pavement, the same rusted bus stops, and the same flickering streetlights I had left behind. Nothing had shifted. The city was a static, frozen loop, indifferent to the fact that I had been hollowed out. I reached my apartment, the key turning in the lock with a familiar, grating sound. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the refrigerator. I sat on the floor, my legs pulled to my chest, staring at the suitcase by the door. It was still packed, a heavy, silent monument to a life I could no longer claim. I checked my bank balance on the phone. The numbers were there, thousands of dollars, but they felt like lead. Every digit was stained. Every transaction felt like a transaction of my own skin. I was a ghost who could not find a way to move forward. The phone vibrated against the floorboards, a sharp, buzzing insect in the quiet. It was my mother. She wanted me to come over for a barbecue with Gary. I stared at the screen, the light reflecting in my eyes, and felt the familiar pressure in my chest. I could have told her. I could have laid out the truth like a map of my own destruction, but the words died before they reached my throat. I said I was tired. I said I needed to sleep. She accepted it without a second thought, her voice bright and oblivious. I hung up, and the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. I walked to the bathroom and caught my reflection. I still smelled like that perfume, the sweet, cloying scent of the villas. I scrubbed my wrists until they turned red, but the scent remained. It was not just a smell. It was the physical residue of the life I had tried to buy. I sat back down on the floor, the cold tile pressing against my spine. I looked at the suitcase, still sitting by the door, its contents a silent, mocking weight. I looked at the suitcase again. It was just a bag. I looked at the floor. It was just wood. I was 20 years old, and the world outside was still turning. I pushed my palms against the floorboards and felt the grain under my skin. I stood up. The room swayed, then steadied. I walked to the hallway, reached for my coat, and pulled it tight around my shoulders. The air in the apartment was stale, but the air outside would be sharp and real. I didn't need a plan for the next year. I didn't need to fix the past. I just needed to walk to the grocery store. I needed to buy milk. I needed to buy bread. I opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and heard the lock click shut behind me. I was moving. For today, that was enough.